Grab a cup of tea or a glass of wine and tune in for Inspired Conversations with publisher Linda Joy. On Tuesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern, Linda creates sacred space for leading female luminaries, empowering authors, heart-centered female entrepreneurs, coaches, and healers. A soulful venue where guests openly share the fears and obstacles they've overcome, wisdom and lessons learned, and the personal journey that led them to the transformational work they do in the world. Inspired Conversations to empower you on your path to authentic, soulful living.
Welcome to Inspired Conversations. I'm your host, Mindset Elevation Coach, Intentional Living Guide, Linda Joy. I have been hosting the show for over 8 years, and one of the things that lights me up about doing it is to be able to bring important conversations to you. You know, navigating life isn't always easy. Navigating relationships can be even harder. And today we're going to be talking about understanding ruptured mother-daughter relationships. And with me today is Khara Croswaite Brindle, a licensed mental health therapist in private practice in Denver. She holds various roles, including financial therapist, TEDx speaker, burnout consultant, author, and a professor. And we're going to have a deep dive conversation about something that I know at least 3 or 4 people in my own life that are navigating this. So welcome, my friend. I'm so glad you're here with me to have this important conversation.
Thank you, Linda. Excited to be here.
One of the things that I really just wanted to dive in about is about a lot of assumptions we make when we hear that a mother is estranged from her daughter, right? We automatically go into, oh, it must have been this or it must have been that. And what are some assumptions about estrangement that you feel in the work and research you did that need to finally be dispelled?
Yeah, when I wrote this book, I was really thinking about adult daughter's experience, but I think this applies to both mother and daughter, these assumptions we're about to talk about. There's a big assumption of mental health, which sometimes is valid and sometimes isn't, where it's like, oh, it's mother's mental health that drove them apart, or it's daughter's mental health that made her choose to estrange. And so I think that's an assumption that has, been across all walks of life, and I don't think it's always in play. The biggest assumption that is hardest to name to you is mental health professionals pushing estrangement. So there's this rumor that we're telling our clients to estrange from their mothers, which I think from a place of boundaries and empowerment, I could see where that's coming from. And yet any good therapist should not be doing that, should not be saying, hey, let's break up with your mom or your dad or your sibling. And so those are just 2 of the 10 assumptions we talk about in the book. Other things like spite and resentment and holding grandchildren hostage, like these are all assumptions that are being made in the community.
I love that we're talking about those assumptions too, because there's in your book, which is called Understanding Ruptured Mother-Daughter Relationships, Guiding the Adult Daughter's Healing Journey Through the Estrangement Energy Cycle. What led you to working with the daughters who are estranged from their mom? What led you to even start this journey into this topic?
Yeah, I've been a clinician for 14 years now, and I was starting to see a pattern back in 2020 with the women I'd served up until that point. And regardless of where they came from, their SES, their background, a lot of them were coming in to work on trauma, but then there was this piece around mom and the relationship with mom. And so I wrote a blog in 2020 and said, hey, here's what I'm seeing. Is any other mental health professional seeing this? And I had a lot of responses. I was like, yep, that tracks. And so at that point, I knew that a book was in my future because it wasn't being talked about from this lens of estrangement energy or 8 stages that women might go through. And so that really inspired me to say, I need to put this out there, that the women I was serving, this was in honor of them, and for a lot of other women that didn't feel seen.
What a beautiful mission. So in your work, was you noticing that it was the daughters initiating the estrangement, vice versa, or a combination of both?
For the women I was serving, a lot of them felt it was on their shoulders to make a change. So they were the ones saying, I have to decide to estrange from mom. There's 2 types of estrangement that are worth naming. There's emotional estrangement and physical estrangement. So when people hear the word estrangement, they tend to think physical, which is we have no ties, no contact, You don't know where I live, you can't call me, those kinds of things. But a lot of the women I was serving as a mental health clinician were actually in emotional estrangement, which meant they were just trying to distance themselves just a little bit. Maybe less phone calls, less get togethers, shorter time at holidays. They were trying to create these boundaries for themselves because it was hurting them, but they didn't want to break ties completely. Unfortunately, many of those women then had to move towards physical estrangement because the pattern of abuse or neglect or whatever was going on continued. So they had to make that difficult choice.
And that's so hard too, because, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, it creates a ripple throughout the whole family, doesn't it? Especially if the adult daughter has children. So there's
Mhm.
that layer. Do you discuss that in the book also?
I do. Yes, we talk about the ripple effect on families when it comes to siblings of daughter and mom. We talk about children and what to say to children when they have questions about estrangement. So I try to look at this whole system of how these people are impacted in a family. Because on my personal life, I actually am married into a family that has 4 generations of estrangement. So we're navigating these, what I call, like, it feels like landmines or like walking on eggshells, or like, oh, I can't talk about this person with this other person. They act like they've died, but they're right here. They're just not speaking. And so I wanted to honor the fact that this is really stressful and impactful on families, in addition to mother and daughter. It's not easy for anyone.
No, and do you think too, like there's a feeling of judgment on both sides, mother and daughter, of what will people think?
Absolutely. Yes, 100%. I mean, for daughter, it's the assumptions that she was impulsive and selfish and petty. For mom, it's you must be an abuser for your daughter not to want to speak to you. And it's not that black and white. There's a lot of gray area. I think for a lot of the women I was working with, this was a long, slow buildup for them to finally say, I can't do this anymore. And so they tried different things. They might have said, man, if mom would just go to therapy with me, or if we'd do family therapy, this might be different. But eventually they felt like they had to take the choice into their own hands, which is when estrangement showed up as possible.
Oh, okay, I see. And now, are there signs, as a therapist, are there signs that would show up in a mother-daughter relationship that you would advise either emotional or physical estrangement?
I think if we had to simplify it, it's that physical and emotional safety. It comes into play of like if daughter doesn't feel like she can be physically safe from her mother. So let's say if mom is physically violent, assaults daughter, that daughter then might need to be like, I can't be connected to you. You can't be a part of my life. On the emotional side, I think the things like trauma and abuse and neglect, which a lot of these young adult daughters are questioning, going, this seems different. Maybe it's coming from social media, maybe it's coming from a connection with another person, and going, their life looks different than mine. And now I'm starting to have questions about my relationship with my mom. And so I think all that to say, I can't emphasize enough, this is so difficult for people to handle, but I don't think it's not completely predictable, but there's definitely things and patterns I've seen, which is why I wrote the book that I did, to be like, hey, let's look at the 8 stages of what you might go through to get here. And it's not usually overnight, all of a sudden I'm not talking to you, which is still an assumption of estrangement.
Yeah, and I've had friends that just I know, like I'm talking about 20 years ago, they really, I would say it was more emotional estrangement. They still went to all the family functions and they were respectful to their mom, but they weren't. I can remember going to the functions. You could feel the energy. I can't describe what it was. Respectful, but very distant, almost like a distant friend more than a mother.
Yeah. Yeah, like they're associates to each other. They're not actually connected by blood or family ties.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
what are some of the things you would say to the children about family estrangement for those that the daughters have children, which is, of course, the grandchildren to the mom?
Yeah, I'm trying to coach parents and caregivers and therapists to talk to kids about estrangement, because just like death and divorce and suicide, like these really heavy topics with kids, what we know is that we have to have honest, open conversations with kids, right? Like they have a BS monitor, they know when we're lying to them. And so to like pretend like everything's okay, when you just described, oh, I could feel this energy difference between these two people in a public setting. Like kids can feel that too, probably more than even adults can. And so some of the things I'm encouraging parents to think about is, what would you say now before it's even asked by your kid? How can you prepare for this conversation? What are you prepared to say to them? Because we want to keep it short and straightforward. We don't want to over describe it. We don't want to parentify our kids and make it their problem, but we want to meet them where they're at. So sometimes it's a simple question like, do they look like me? What kind of food do they eat? Where do they live? And other times, as these children get older, think adolescents, they might have more complex questions to ask of us. So one of my 5 tips for parents is keep it short and straightforward, but also plan ahead. Start thinking now about what you would say as your kid might come to you one day saying, hey, why don't we talk to grandma?
Yeah, that was one of my questions because if the children have the grandchildren have been estranged from the beginning, then they don't have that relationship anyway. But what happens if the estrangement comes and these children have already built a relationship with their grandmother? They have a deep loss when it suddenly ends. That's got to be a whole nother issue that rises up when mothers and daughters are estranged.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's confusion. There might be anger. There's definitely sadness for these kids. I was inspired after writing this book for adult daughters and the clinicians that serve them. I also wrote a children's book to really say, how do we model this? How can we use bibliotherapy to like normalize that this happens, that all families look different? And so that was one of my funnest projects last year, was to be able to say, what would I want if I was a kid? I'm thinking of my nieces and nephews because they are children going through this with 4 generations of estrangement. But what kind of questions are they going to have? And what do they want parents to do? Right. So I modeled this with a children's story where mom and dad are open, they're regulated, they're calm, and they're like, hey, what questions do you have for us? And so far, I'm hearing that this book has been a tool to help those kids understand that change of like, hey, let's read this together. How is this showing up for you? And all of a sudden the kid's going, oh, is this why we don't talk to grandma? So it might actually kind of, for lack of a better word, grease the wheels in that conversation when child is very bewildered.
Oh, I love that you wrote a book for children because I know, like, my granddaughter's an avid reader, and for her, she would pick up on the messaging in the book more than the
Mm,
conversation because she likes to have deep conversations when she's ready. But because she's an avid reader, I think that is a great way for them to like process it in their own energy and space.
hmm Absolutely. So yeah, I have a colleague in mind that her children have just recently had questions about why they're not speaking to grandma. So to the very circumstance you named, they'd had grandma in their life, and all of a sudden grandma's not around and not invited to things. And so this book has been a very welcome tool in that family, which has been heartwarming and heartbreaking at the same time to hear of like, hey, you're going through this, and this children's book has been helpful to them.
Yeah, and it's also important that they don't feel that they did something wrong and grandma doesn't love them or their behavior caused something. So there's so many nuances to this, isn't it? The ripple effect.
Absolutely. I mean, this is where I've actually asked child therapists, hey, what else do we need to know? Because kids are wired to think this is on them, right? It's partly that ego, that development of their prefrontal cortex, and just like being wired to go, oh, this is my problem. We see this with divorce, we see this with relationships ending. So why wouldn't they go, oh, I made mom and grandma stop talking? So I think it's really important that parents speak to the truth, even if it's in short little bursts, because that's what the child needs right then. So it doesn't have to be a whole long explanation, but it might be something like, you know what, grandma and I don't see eye to eye, or grandma hurt me when I was a kid and I need some space from her. I have a lot of parents who worry that their children are going to resent them for not letting them see their grandparents. And so coaching them on how to describe that to kids is so, so important.
That's so powerful. And we're going to get ready for our first break, but I want to invite everyone to visit Khara at estrangementenergycycle.com. Grab a copy of her book, Understanding Ruptured Mother-Daughter Relationships, as well as her children's book. Again, that's estrangementenergycycle.com. We'll be back in a moment.
Inspiration for a Woman's Soul. Aspire Magazine, inspiring and supporting women on the path of self-discovery. Claim your free digital subscription today, which includes access to thousands of dollars of personal development bonus gifts from Team Inspiration partners. Claim your Aspire magazine subscription today at subscribetoaspire.com.
Welcome back. You're listening to Inspired Conversations. Thanks for joining me today. I am here with Khara Croswaite Brindle, licensed mental health therapist and author of the new book, Understanding Ruptured Mother-Daughter Relationships. So Khara, in our conversation, you mentioned the estrangement energy cycle. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So this is that pattern of what I was seeing with multiple women in mental health when I was their therapist and saying, I think there's something to this. So the estrangement energy cycle, the word energy is very purposeful here because some of these women are just thinking about estrangement. They haven't acted on it. They haven't moved into the cycle fully. They're just putting some energy, some mental energy toward it. But then there are women who are actually going through the 8 stages. So stage 1 is usually a realization that something was abusive or traumatic or harmful to adult daughter, right? So that might come from therapy, might come from a colleague, might be coming from going off to college and going, these relationships look different than mine. But pinpointing that as abusive or having a cycle of abuse is what usually catapults them in to the estrangement energy cycle. So that's stage 1. Stage 2 is questioning what they want to do with that information. Do I want to focus on the present? Do I want to broach this with mom and talk to her about it? Do I want to ignore it? So more often than not, they want a sense of acknowledgement and closure. So these daughters then go into asking mom, what's up with that? Depending on how mom responds, if she's heartfelt and apologetic and authentic, then we don't have to go further into the cycle, right? The cycle kind of stops there because there's healing that happens. But for the women I was serving, more often than not, they were getting responses of defensiveness. Mom was manipulating, mom was angry, and mom was pointing fingers back to daughter going, this is your problem. This isn't about me. So as you can imagine, Linda, that doesn't bode well. And for the 4th stage, they move fully into estrangement, whether that's emotional or physical. Those are just the first 4 of 8 stages. I'm going to pause there and see what questions you have for me.
Yeah, I think the response part, right? With my girlfriend, I do spiritual life coaching. This is probably 10 years ago. She was at the questioning stage, and it was weighing her down so much because she was afraid to have the conversation with her mom about the childhood stuff. And I said, it's costing you more not to have the conversation, the energy, the weight, the repetitive thoughts. But she was one, as you just described, the mother became very defensive, attacking, and it just caused the wound to get even deeper. And
That's
so
right.
they became estranged. And up until, I think they stayed estranged for, God, has to be 8, 9 years. And they're just starting to reconnect now. So that question, as you said, when it begins, that kind of can either stop the process if there's healing in that conversation, or it escalates it, which is out of the daughter's hands, really.
Yeah. I mean, this is where I think there's this fantasy for adult daughters that they would really like for mom to show up authentically, where she could say, you're right, I've made some choices I'm not proud of. I'm human. I made a mistake and I apologize sincerely for what happened. And then the action is, I'm going to do better. I'm going to do something different from here forward. So many women I've talked to over the years are like, that's what I want. But then I use the word fantasy because a lot of them feel like that's never going to happen unless mom does her own work. So this cycle really speaks to adult daughter doing this work on her own. It's not through family therapy, it's her own healing journey because of that, how painful that is. So absolutely, questioning can take weeks, months, years of internal questioning, that emotional labor you described with your friend, versus then going to mom saying, hey, this is what I want answers on. And mom's response can make or break it.
Yeah, I can remember, like, I can still remember where we were sitting and talking, and I said, what is your deepest fear? She goes, that I will have to make a decision. And she said, in the ripple, she used that phrase, the ripple effect it would have on her children who were very close to the mother, as well as her siblings and their children. She said, it would be like I'd be disconnecting from the whole family. So it was that weight of the story she was carrying about that conversation, but it was costing her so much physically, emotionally, spiritually not to have it. So is that a
Mhm.
big fear of a lot of the daughters you see is, oh my goodness, I may become disconnected from my core family?
Absolutely. There's that scrutiny, that judgment, even the rejection, right? Of like, oh, now I'm ostracized from this family. I'm the problem, right? When adult daughter isn't the problem, but now she's being scapegoated as the problem. And so that has that ripple effect. A ton of families try to pick sides, right? Of like, are they going to align with adult daughter who made the choice? Are they going to align with mom who's maybe seen as the victim of the choice? And so all of that leads to this emotional labor, this emotional load we're talking about, that this is not an easy choice, which is actually stage 5 is grief and loss of the cycle, because it's like, this was not easy on daughter. It's not easy on mom. It's not easy on the family. But so many people think adult daughter is happy when she estranges from mom. And I don't think happy is the right word. She might feel relief that the cycle has been broken, but she's probably still in grief and loss, mourning the mother she wished she had. That's what I heard more often.
Yeah, and now that you said that, w it was her siblings, it wasn't well received, her conversation with the mother. Her siblings took sides, so she became estranged from one of her sisters because the sister said, "Your belief in your childhood isn't what happened," because she has her own journey, right?
Right.
And then, of course, the mother manipulated that, so it caused such a ripple effect. But she said, now looking back, she has no regrets that she took care of her emotional, spiritual health.
Mm. Hmm.
So I think, do you hear that too, that it was costing them too much not to take the next step?
Absolutely. I think there's this like the in between is really uncomfortable for us as humans, right? Of like, I'm in between deciding to stay in this relationship or deciding to go. And so, just the toll that takes mentally, physically, emotionally, I think people do feel lighter in some ways, but then it also allows space for that grief of like, oh, this is actually happening. The data says that when someone estranges from a family member, it feels like a death has happened. And so that's where also grief and loss shows up in here, is it's like I'm no longer in the in between, but now I'm actually in self permission to grieve the loss of that parent or sibling or child, depending on what that looks like.
That's powerful. Now we got up to number 5, which was grief and loss was number 5. What are the next 3?
Yeah. So once they get through that grief and loss work, I mean, that tends to be where people are in therapy or with a coach or any other spiritual guide. Sometimes this is where they want support, is in that grief and loss journey. And then they move into discovering sense of self, which is stage 6 here. And so that, as a therapist, is one of my favorites because they're starting to figure out who they are when they stand alone outside of a family system, outside of mom's wants and needs. So, from the lens of, let's say, an abusive parent, if a parent has mm, judged me for my weight, my looks, my smart or lack of smart ability, then all of a sudden I'm like trying to figure out who I am without her influence, right? So for me as a therapist, this was a beautiful coming into their own story for these women where they're like, oh, I actually like this kind of thing. I like this kind of music. I like this kind of art. I like to dress in these kinds of clothes because mom's voice is not telling them, her presence is not telling them this is who you are. So discovering sense of self is a beautiful part of the journey because they start to be like, here's who I am as me.
It gotta be so liberating too, you know?
Mhm.
That has to feel so liberating. And what's number 7?
Deeper work. So then we start to have realizations about other relationships in our life. So even though none of us want to admit this as humans, we tend to be attracted to people in our life that are similar to the people in our family, right? So if we have an abuser at home in our family system as a child, we might be attracted to an abuser in a romantic partner or similar behaviors. And so the deeper work might be, oh, here's my attachment trauma, here's my anxious attachment, here's my people pleasing, and how that ripples out onto parenting and intimate partner relationships. So deeper work is really looking at your whole system of support and being like, how is this healthy? Are these relationships serving me? And for a lot of these women, it was aha moments of, oh, I married my mother,
Yeah.
which is not something we want to admit. And I'm saying this playfully, but it's like we go with what we know. We go with what's comfortable and predictable. And so sometimes that's what it looks like when we pair up with people who are abusive, as just one example. So that's what I mean by deeper work.
And number 8?
Redefining self worth. So if we've gone into new identity and we've done the deeper work to heal other relationships outside of mom, now we're redefining self-worth as in I am worthy as I am. I am okay even if I'm not connected to my mother or my siblings or my father or whoever it is. And so for a lot of women, it's that I'm taking up space and I'm worthy as a person. And that's beautiful too.
No, it is beautiful. It's one of the things I'm hearing is this is like a journey. These 8 steps are a journey of healing, right? And
Hmm.
in your book, you share about the estrangement energy cycle and give a deeper understanding about each of the stages. Do some women stay in some stages longer than others, or it's because it sounds like it's very individual and personal to their own journey?
Yes, that's absolutely right. So, like, even just grief and loss is the example that pops into my mind. Grief and loss, there is no timeline of like, you're going to be fine in 3 months, you're going to be fine in 6 months. That goes for any loss that we have. So, mom and the relationship with mom is no different. One woman, it might be a couple months, another woman, it could be 12 years of grief and loss. It really just depends on where she is in her own work, her resources, and her support system to help her move through. And so, it is very individualized. And for some of these women, they might go back into the cycle. Like maybe they decide to reconnect with mom, but mom hasn't done her own work. And so now we're catapulted back in and we're kind of working through it again. And so to normalize that each person's journey is unique, I think is really important here because sometimes like going around and around a couple times when trying to reconcile.
Yeah, because on step 4 is estrangement, and earlier you talked about emotional and physical estrangement. So maybe at first a woman may choose the emotional estrangement, but realize later that she needs to move into physical. So it's like layers being peeled back.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. Where they're like, oh, I thought this was going to help me. Maybe it would soften the blow, but they're still feeling that emotional labor, that emotional load, just like your friend. And so then they might make that difficult choice of, oh, I have to make this more official by telling them, I'm not going to speak to you. You are blocked from my phone. Do not contact me. And that feels very different than someone who's like, oh, I'm too busy. I've got a lot going on. I'll talk to you later. Like that passive estrangement kind of aspect feels more gentle to a lot of women, which is partly being female. And so I think there's like aspects of what does it mean to be a woman, to be a people pleaser, to be a caregiver, aspects of patriarchy. Like there's a lot here. I didn't go into all that in this book in particular, but a lot of the research I did was like, hey, there really is something between mothers and daughters that makes this so painful compared to other relationships that are estranged.
This is such a powerful conversation. And we're going to take our next break. And when we come back, we're going to continue this conversation. In the meantime, I invite everyone to visit estrangementenergycycle.com, grab a copy of Khara's book, Understanding Ruptured Mother-Daughter Relationships, and check out everything else that she has for supportive resources there. We'll be back in a moment, my friends.
It's time to begin the adventure of a lifetime by nurturing the most important relationship you will ever have, the relationship with yourself. Kelly Grimes, self-nurturing expert, speaker, and author of the bestseller, The Art of Self-Nurturing, a field guide to living with more peace, joy, and meaning, shares that a self-nurturing practice is not about being perfect or completing another thing on your to-do list, but rather nurturing a relationship with yourself. In The Art of Self-Nurturing, you'll discover the inspiration, examples, reflective questions, and self-nurturing practices that will empower you to become the artist of your own life and see self-nurturing as an art form. Rather than living from obligation and overwhelm, you will learn to cultivate a life filled with self-compassion and self-love. Order your copy today at artofselfnurturingbook.com and receive the Self-Nurturing Starter Kit as a supportive gift.
You're listening to Inspired Conversations. Thanks for circling up with us today. So, Khara, those 8 steps of the estrangement energy cycle, they're linear, right? Because you notice with your clients that they're moving through all these stages, and you talked about, how it's different for every woman.
Mhm.
How how do you suggest women are handling this emotional roller coaster? Because that is an emotional roller coaster, those 8 steps, right? It's these ups and downs and twists and turns. Any
Mhm.
tips for someone who right now may be in the midst of this life challenge, I guess we could call it. Um, I think the first step would be to get your book so they can identify where they are. I'm just thinking
Yeah.
that, wait a minute, if they could just understand where they are in that
Mhm.
energy cycle, I think that alone would be so validating and liberating to know, one, they're not alone. Two, it's completely normal what they're feeling. What do you have to add to that?
I really appreciate that feedback, Linda, because that's the message I've gotten from women who picked up the book is where they're like, I feel seen, I feel affirmed, I feel validated. And in other interviews I've talked about, this book feels like a love letter to adult daughters of like, hey, I want to be one of many voices for you. Unfortunately, in the realm of estrangement, there are more books out there for parents than there are for adult children. And so I felt called to speak to what I was seeing for the women who were doing the work, right? They were coming in working on themselves. And so, to your question of what can women do, yes, they can get a copy of the book, they can see where they are in the cycle. But the two words that showed up so loudly in my head are grace and self compassion of like, this is tough. This is not an easy process for you. And maybe that second message would be you don't have to do this alone. You can do this with a coach, a therapist, a mentor, a friend, another trusted person in your life to be like, hey, I'm not crazy. This is the cycle. This is where I'm at, and this is where I need support.
That's beautiful. And I love that you noticed an underserved population because you're right. There's always books for the parents, but never for the, I haven't seen for the children. And that's what drew me to your book. And that's why I invited you to write an article for Aspire magazine because, like I told you, I have a large community. So I'm always hearing stories like this, for
Mhm.
whatever reason. So another question for you is, let's say they become estranged. Let's say it's either or, emotional or physical. But then later on, the parent decides to do her inner work. Have you ever seen a case where at first it felt like the mother wasn't going to change? So, of course, the daughter, for her own health and wellness, became estranged. Did you ever notice that a mother said, oh my goodness, this is a deep wound for her. I'm going to do my work. And then they reconnected?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's the hope for all listeners today is that that is possible. You know, they say 1 in 12 people is estranged from at least one family member. So this is happening and pretty common, 1 in 12. And then in a recent study in 2022, I guess not super recent, but somewhat recent, 82% of mother daughters reconciled. Now, that study, I had questions of what allowed them to reconcile, that there was no data for that. It was, they reported estrangement and then they reported reconciliation, but they didn't say how long or what it took to reconcile. But 82% sounds pretty good of like, okay, there's hope for mothers and daughters to heal. But I think of Dr. Joshua Coleman's work. He's the person saying, hey, parents, I want to coach you in how to write this letter of outreach to your child, how to start the reconciliation process. And so I reference him a couple times in the book, being like, if you are a parent picking up this book, trying to understand your adult daughter and her experience, know that you need to check some things out for yourself, like what's your agenda? Have you done your own work? What's the purpose of reconciling? And so I think that's what you're getting at, Linda. Like, I mean, it's possible they can reconcile, but we want it to be for the quote unquote right reasons, which is health and healing.
Yes, exactly. Not out of guilt or shame on the daughter's side because she chose estrangement. And I love that you said grace and self-compassion. I'm always telling women, give yourself grace, darling. You've never done this thing called life before. You're figuring it out as you go. Like it didn't
Uh-huh.
come with the user's manual. And women, as you said, we have a tendency to be so hard on ourselves, but especially we have this story within us of our family unit, right? That it's our job to hold the family together, the family meaning, our original family. And I
Hmm.
remember doing that. We have a stranger in our family, not with mother and daughter, but with other family members, and I've witnessed it play out. And in most of the cases, there's only like 3 estrangements in the family, all women, and they struggled for a long time because they thought I had to take this behavior because if I don't, what will others think if I disconnect from the family? And I'm
Mm.
like, they'll think you're healthy, right?
Right.
And I say that with such grace and love with, because everyone knows my story. I was a former welfare mom, runaway, high school dropout, queen of self-sabotage, and we had family issues. And it took me a long time to go, I'm 62 now, to go through that healing over the last 30 years to heal all those wounds between family members and more. And I get
Mm.
it. But this is so deep because now that I'm a grandmother, right? I have a 24-year-old grandson and then a soon to be 13-year-old granddaughter. I look at those family ripple effects. And then I say to myself, and I did this when my daughter was young, Khara, I was in an unhealthy relationship and I didn't have the strength to leave for myself. And I think a lot of women are shaking their heads because they know what I'm saying. But when I looked at my then 5-year-old daughter and said, is this the type of relationship I want her to think is healthy? And
Mm.
I asked myself that question. I knew it wasn't healthy, and that gave me the strength to leave and change. Well, it's the same thing with family estrangements, right? We're the
Mm.
role model for our children, so if they see us in an unhealthy relationship, I think it's healthier to leave that relationship, even if it is the mom.
Yeah, and I think you're onto something of like we tend to leave unhealthy relationships for others if we can't do it for ourselves, right? To like try and break that trauma legacy, the intergenerational trauma. I think of the book Mother Daughter Puzzle, and one of my exercises in that book, it's someone else's book. I'll have to grab the name, but in Mother Daughter Puzzle, she has people do a family tree with just the women in the family, so the family female line, and it looks at grandma, mom, and daughter if there are those three players in the family, and it talks about what did grandma go through that she would then resist in her daughter, right? So if grandma, for example, is part of a generation that's like you stay with abusive men for financial security. Okay, so grandma stayed with an abuser. And then, as you just named, does that model onto daughter who's like, oh, I have to stay with a partner who's not healthy but financially stable for me? And then is that now moving towards daughter? So, like, patterns tend to repeat themselves, right? And so we're trying to break those patterns with the self awareness of this energy cycle or any other tool that people are grabbing. But it was just really powerful to see it mapped out of like, if grandma felt like she had to sacrifice her wants and needs, then she probably wouldn't celebrate mom working and being a parent, for example. And then does that change with daughter getting a promotion and people not celebrating it properly because it's not valued in this family? I don't know if I'm articulating this well, but it's a very powerful exercise for listeners to be like, let's map out the females in our family tree and see what's there.
Oh, I can see the wisdom that would be within that exercise because we don't understand where their journey brought them in the choices they made, and it just keeps
Mm-hmm.
rippling down to the family. So I've always said, Aspire magazine's 18 years old now, and I call her she. She has her own energy, so she she is all about bringing women content that inspires, empowers, and supports them in living their most aligned, intentional life. And I do that by bringing other women leaders like yourself as content providers. And one of the things I always say is, ladies, you gotta nurture yourself from the inside out because you are the nurturers of the next generation. We need to heal to end whatever cycles may be in our lives, right? That are just passed down unconsciously. So, this whole conversation really fits into my message with Aspire and my show and my other media brands because the mother-daughter relationship I think, is the core for so many women. And I think we all get wounded in that relationship in some way, but for many others, there's a real depth of woundedness. Do you
Mm-hmm.
find that some people judge their journey in their relationship with their mom and go, "Oh, my life wasn't really that bad. Who am I to want to estrange from her compared to my friend so and so who had this, real tough life?" Do you find they do that to themselves too?
Definitely. I mean, especially from this lens of what's wrong with me? I should try harder, right? I've heard that a lot of, what am I missing? I should try harder to repair with my mom. Like they took that burden on their own shoulders and left none of it for mom to shoulder, to handle. And yeah, when we have so much out there now that says, here's the burden, here's the hardness of other people's lives. I think a lot of these women did question, why am I complaining? I had food on the table, I had a roof over my head, but they had no emotional attachment. And they're like, well, I had my basic needs met. Why am I complaining? I should be fine. But on the inside, like your friend, they were questioning all sorts of things, going, was that enough? Am I asking too much for wanting unconditional love or healthy attachment? And so it really was quite a mind game for them to get to a place where they're like, I deserve these things. These are not too much to ask. And they came from generations of people who are like, well, I provided for you and that was enough, but they weren't emotionally available. So we're healing some of that absence of emotional availability.
Wow. Even in my own family, you can see all the little nuances of how, isn't this part funny? You can all be raised by the same mother and all have a different experience or memories of your
Mhm.
childhood. That has always blown me away. Like, where were you in this
That's right.
picture? But I honor that. Everyone's truth is their truth. But like, I can have conversations with my siblings and they're like, what? That happened? And I'm like, we all pick and choose what we want to remember, I think, too. But it doesn't mean my truth is different from their truth and their truth is wrong. But do you notice
Mhm.
that a lot of times we come into, we're in the estrangement energy cycle, that we may turn to our siblings and go, I want you to understand it from my perspective, but they have a completely different perspective and understanding of your childhood.
Very common. It's one of the things I name as false memories in the book of like an assumption is this didn't happen, as you named, by the parent saying that didn't happen. I don't remember that. You're making that up. And then going to siblings and be like, well, my recollection is different. But it makes me think of eyewitness testimony where there's like four people who see something happen, like a car accident, and you interview all four of them, and they have different details that have been solidified from that event. This is true in families, as you so beautifully named, of like one child might be like, mom was great. But what if they were also the favorite child? I mean, as a mother, I hope that, I don't want people to think we're here favoriting our one child over another. But like, what if that happened? What if they had a close knit, connected relationship, but then her adult daughter, she felt less than? I see this with male female siblings, where maybe male sibling was like held up and supported, but then female sibling was like, I never felt supported at all. I've seen it with oldest versus youngest child, like so many different dynamics here. And so, yeah, I mean, there's just a lot here.
Yeah, there is. And we're going to take our final break and come back for the last 10 minutes. And I want to invite everyone, please, whether it's you that may be experiencing what we're talking about today or a loved one, grab a copy of Understanding Ruptured Mother-Daughter Relationships. You can do that at estrangementenergycycle.com. We'll be back in a moment.
Your truest, deepest desires are calling you. The question is, will you answer the call? Former high-tech Fortune 500 leader Sharon Seberg knows how it feels to wear busyness as a badge of honor and to smother her dreams with the expectations of others. Walking away from her successful yet unfulfilling career, she chose to live a life connected to her intuitive wisdom and divine truth, and now lives a life of fulfillment, peace, and abundance. Today, Sharon is a neurotransformational coach, feminine power facilitator, and the visionary founder of the Soul Alignment Formula. She empathetically fuses cutting-edge neuroscience with intuitive coaching, supporting successful women to unlock their full potential so they can live a life of authenticity and freedom. Are you ready to excavate your deepest desires and bring them to life? Start by visiting SharonSeberg.com.
Welcome back. You're listening to Inspired Conversations. I'm your host, Linda Joy, and with me today is Khara Croswaite Brindle, author of Understanding Ruptured Mother-Daughter Relationships. So in our last few minutes, if someone feels they're in that energy, I guess it would be that questioning energy, which I believe is
Mhm.
step 2 or 3.
Two. Yep. Mhm.
Step 2, what would your guidance be aside from getting a copy of your book? Because we know they're already going to do that if they're listening to this show. So, like, what is some self-reflection or other strategies that they could begin with?
Yeah. So on the website, I know you've named a couple times, estrangementenergycycle.com. I actually have a checklist of warning signs for mothers and warning signs for daughters. And so for some folks, they just want to take that into consideration. Maybe they journal about it. Maybe they check a few of the boxes and say, is there something here that needs to be worked on with mom? Right. So it's not meant to be a diagnostic tool of, oh, you should estrange from your mother, but it might give them a place to start the conversation of, hey, mom, I took this quiz and I was kind of thinking about this and I wanted to talk to you about it. And same for mom. She might take her side of that quiz and say, I have some things to talk to daughter about. So being curious, there's so much content on social media that I think it's about staying aligned with your own values. So you're not swayed by, oh, here's someone saying everyone should go no contact, or here's someone saying everyone should reconcile. Because we are seeing those polarized systems out there on social media of like, I'm going to side with daughter, I'm going to side with mother. And I tried really hard with this book and the materials to be like, this is your journey. This is your self exploration. I'm not telling you to estrange. I'm not telling you to reconcile, but I want to give you some tools to take that deeper dive.
I love that. I love that you have the checklists that are available to everyone. So again, everyone, there's 2 checklists there for you, and you can find them at estrangementenergycycle.com. And what's the title of your children's book?
Yeah, it's called Penny McGee's Family Tree, talking to children about family estrangement.
I like the name, Penny McGee. And I think it's so important, as you shared, in that we have these conversations with our children and not think that we're sheltering them from the truth, because something you said that really resonated, because I'm a big believer in energy, and today's children are so tuned in that you think you're protecting them, but all they know is they know something's not right. And when
Mhm.
we think we're trying to protect them by not being honest, we're actually, I believe, giving them false information, which then gets them to not trust their own intuition and truth. They
Mhm.
know, like you said earlier, they can feel the difference in the relationship. So is there a certain age you feel that we should start having those conversations? Because I know it's hard to tell a 3-year-old, but would you even have a conversation with a 3-year-old who's asking where grandma is?
Yeah, I mean, I think if they're asking, like you kind of named, we want to be able to have an answer, even if it's the age appropriate answer of grandma and I aren't talking right now. And they go, okay. And I go play with their toys, right? So some of these younger children have one question. The example I wrote in the book is like asking, what do they like mashed potatoes? No? Okay. Now I'm going to go play. So a 3 year
Yeah.
old might be at that level. I have a 2.5 year old at home right now. And so I feel like, I wouldn't lie to her, but I'd probably keep it pretty simple and short for her versus like a 10 to 12 to adolescent age child's going to know more about relationship dynamics because they're in that phase of life, and they're going to have more questions of what happened, what did grandma do, what did you do, what's going on. And so that's what I love about this children's book and the estrangement energy book is it's giving people a chance to think ahead. So we don't have to react in our emotions. We don't have to react defensively. We don't have to have our own hurt dump on our children when they ask a simple question, because they actually surprise us by having it be pretty simple, that they want to know an answer, a 1 word response or 1 sentence, and then they're off and playing. And so if you have a very tuned in 3 year old asking, I would say answer in short and sweet ways, because it doesn't have to be over explained.
Yeah, and it has to be, I feel like, meet them where they are emotionally, right?
That's
Some
right. Mm-hmm.
some kids, my granddaughter's very emotionally aware. She's 13, reads energy. You can't energetically bullshit her, excuse me. So
Exactly. I was
yeah,
thinking of
we
her. I was
learned
like,
that
yeah,
from
you don't want to lie to her.
yeah, we learned it from a young age. She just is extraordinary with energy and animals. And she will ask clear, direct questions. She did even as a young child. But like we knew enough. It was about anything in life. She's just very inquisitive. We always just gave her the information of where she was emotionally at that time, right? And so it's kind of
Mhm.
like that with this, meet them where they are. And
That's
we
right.
still have 4 minutes left. So a quick question is, what are some of the social stigmas attached to mother-daughter estrangement? I just want to make sure we covered that in the last few minutes.
Yeah. So one of the chapters I enjoyed writing the most was a chapter on what to say and what not to say to an estranged daughter. And part of that is coming from this question of the social stigmas, right? So we have family systems and cultures that are like, you put your family first. You aren't selfish. You focus on the family. you're going to regret this, right? So in that chapter, I talk about how painful it is for adult daughter to hear from a stranger, hey, you're not speaking to your mother. You should probably go reconcile. You're going to regret it if you don't. What if she dies? And for a lot of these women, they've grieved the loss of mother as if she died. So, like, to say that to them, one, is painful. Two, lands on deaf ears because they don't really know adult daughter's process. And so I talk a lot about how do we navigate family functions, holidays, Mother's Day, and what we can do as a community to hold compassion for these adult daughters, to not make it worse. Because daughters are going to have triggers for the rest of their life. We live in a society that really celebrates the mother-daughter relationship. So the fact that theirs isn't healthy makes them still question 12, 20 years later, what's wrong with me? So as a community, we cannot perpetuate that. We can actually do something that's more healing by being like, let's look at holidays differently. Let's not assume you have a family. Let's not ask you invasive questions if you don't want to talk about it. So that chapter for me was really important as a loved one watching my spouse's family go through 4 generations of estrangement. I was just like, here's where it's going to help and here's where it's going to hurt.
I love this. And I want to invite everyone again to please go to estrangementenergycycle.com. Make sure you follow Khara on social media. If you know a family that is struggling, she has that children's book also. So be sure to grab a copy of that, but stay connected, educate yourself. And for any woman who is listening, mother or daughter, stay connected with Khara, grab those checklists. You don't have to go through this journey called life alone. This is why I am so passionate about bringing you the experts to remind you that there is always support all around you. You just have to open your arms to receive it, my friends. And Khara, thank you, thank you. This is such an important topic. I'm so excited that you'll be sharing your wisdom in Aspire magazine and now here. So thank you for the work you're doing in the world.
Thank you, Linda. I'm always happy to have these conversations. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Until next time, my friends, choose love, choose joy, choose happiness. Blessings.
Thanks for listening to Inspired Conversations with publisher Linda Joy. Join our sacred space every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern and meet leading female visionaries, empowering authors, heart-centered female entrepreneurs, coaches, and healers. Inspired Conversations with Linda Joy is a soulful venue where guests share the obstacles they've overcome, along with wisdom and lessons learned on their personal journey that led them to the transformational work they do in the world. Inspired Conversations to empower you on your path to authentic and soulful living.